Hello, I'm Matthew Thomas, the Asia Bureau Chief for Euromoney Institutional Investor, and it's my great pleasure today to be joined by Pak Lucky Alphaman, Director General of Budget Financing and Risk Management at Indonesia's Ministry of Finance. In other words, the man in charge of Indonesia's bond issuance. Indonesia has been incredibly busy in the international market this year, coming to the dollar bond market 3 times in the first half of the year, and also selling a 100 billion yen samurai bond in July. The response to these bonds was clear. The country raised almost $10.9 billion, and Indonesia's $4.3 billion bond in April was picked as Global Capital Asia's sovereign bond of the year. But it clearly wasn't easy. Let's find out more. Pak Lucky, can you give us an overview of your approach to funding this year, particularly how your plans had to change as a result of the pandemic?
Thank you, Matthew. So as we know, before the pandemic, Indonesia economic condition, I think, was in a very strong momentum. But things have changed all of a sudden because of this pandemic, which is unprecedented as well as unpredictable. So long story short, we know the way countries deal with this pandemic, of course, vary. However, one thing for sure, that the role of government become very, very key, very, very important in this kind of difficult situation. So for Indonesia, that looking at what happened, especially in March, when we feel the need the urgency to undertake much stronger measures dealing with this pandemic, that politically speaking, the first step is we issued what's called this emergency law. Because again, we know this is extraordinary condition, situation that also needs extraordinary policies or measures. And under this emergency law, for example, some breakthrough, I would say, that now government is allowed to take budget deficit above 3% of GDP.
Yeah.
So the relaxation of this fiscal rule is very important because now country really needs government intervention, government stimulus to deal with this pandemic. And there are some others, but perhaps it's also worth mentioning is that the second breakthrough that dealing with this much bigger financing needs, now Bank Indonesia, our central bank, is allowed to purchase our government or sovereign bonds in the primary markets. Those are two among other policy breakthrough under this emergency law issued in at the end of March 2020. So the next step at that time was, okay, now we know that we have to anticipate the declining in our revenue collection for sure because of this slowdown in economic activities. But on the spending side, government priorities are how to ensure the health sector can be functioning. So we provide this, health equipment, hospitals. If you remember at that time, the issue on about ventilators, things like that, right? Even the hazmat suits becomes very, very important at that time. And second priorities is we also have to make sure that people, especially the vulnerable group, as well as poor people, can maintain their purchasing power, in the sense that, of course, we don't want that poverty to increase, for example, including also the layoff by industry, by businesses.
Yeah.
And so that's why the priority number 3 is to support businesses through various, incentive and support through tax incentive, for example, even that with also some support like guarantee and other means. So long story short, we know spending increased because of this. And again, it turned in, of course, it will widen our deficit, budget deficit. So first, in April, the target of our new budget deficit was set at the level of 5.1% of GDP. So as you can see, before pandemic, our budget deficit is only 1.7%, sorry, 1.8% of GDP. And then in April is already increased to 5.1% of GDP. And then as we know, second quarter has become one of the, I would say, the bottom, kind of the worst situation for us. And it also triggered government to rethink, to revisit. I think we need to do even more. So in revenue side, as I said, that perhaps things is going to be a bit worse. And in spending side, I think economy needs even bigger support from the government.
Yeah.
So again, in June, we revisit, and then we came up with this new deficit, but the deficit even bigger at the level of 6.34% of GDP. So that's how kind of things are very dynamic. That's my point. Okay. So that's why it needs also change. First, we need to adjust our financing strategy for 2020. Looking at the needs, financing needs, that is all of a sudden become much higher, much bigger now. And then at the same time, we also need to look at the market situation, market dynamics at that time.
Yeah.
So in March, we know that all of a sudden there's a huge capital outflow from emerging markets, including Indonesia. We had almost 140 trillion rupiah capital outflow from our government bond alone, right? So of course, it has a huge impact on how we formulate our strategy dealing with this kind of situation. So in April, again, this is about kind of actually, to be honest with you, the original plan was we should come to the market in March actually.
Right.
But again, looking what happened, right, with this very nervous market, I would say. So we decided to kind of postpone a little bit, try to find the right window after, let's say, this kind of panic, I would say. And long story short, again, in April, I think we felt at the time that it's the right time for us to come to the market. I think we are one of the first sovereign came to the market issuing our global bond. And again, this is very challenging. We didn't know actually about the situation, how market would respond, for example, the market appetite. Yes, we did some kind of market intelligence investigation, of course, right? But still, the uncertainty is so, I mean, market is very volatile, very uncertain at that time. And then we decided to come to the market. We were able to use this right tiny window, I would say. And again, I think the result was very positive. I think one factor, because Indonesia has had very good reputation. We have very good credit story. Everything is transparent, nothing to hide. Investors know very well about Indonesia. So that's why when we decided to come to the market, I think investors market already know very well about Indonesia.
Yeah.
I think that's what very positive factor, but kind of the key success, I would say, of this transaction.
Let me ask you about the April deal, because I know there was some talk behind the scenes that this might be an official COVID-19 response bond. In the end, it ended up being something of a hybrid. You decided not to get the official label and explicitly earmark for proceeds for COVID relief. But you did make clear to investors during the marketing of the deal that the majority of the proceeds would be used to fight the impact of the coronavirus. So can you talk us through the thought process there, and particularly what stopped you from going all the way and getting the official COVID label?
Okay, again, we need to go back. We need to really feel about what's going on at that time, what we are dealing with at that time. This is in April. As I said, the pandemic, this COVID-19 just started, and everything had, was still very uncertain. We don't know at that time. We didn't know about the vaccine. At that time, we still kind of busy with this. How many ventilators do we need, right? Do we need to build new hospitals, ICU? Do we have enough beds, hospital beds, something like that, And so that's why dealing with this uncertainty, dealing with this, at the same time, market is very volatile. Timing is very important. That's one. And second, from government point of view, we need two things. First, we have to be able to act or to respond quickly, but at the same time, flexibly. Because again, this is something new for all of us, okay? So need to have quick response and we need flexibility. Those two things are very, very important for policymakers, especially in April in that kind of this situation. So that's why when we preparing ourselves, okay, we need to come to market, we need to issue, we need to find this global financing through these global bonds. And yes, at that time we had options, whether to go officially labeling it as kind of this COVID-19 bond or pandemic bond, or having just regular bond for this budget financing, or maybe as you use this terminology, hybrid one.
Yeah.
Okay. And we had experience, very good experience, lesson learned issuing this what's called thematic bond, which is we had this global green sukuk. And for this thematic bond, for sure, first, for example, that preparation, it needs much more extra effort, even from preparation. And then later on, after delivery, we have to produce report, for example.
Yeah.
Okay. So in April, we had to make decision. As I said, again, dealing with uncertainty. Okay, for COVID-19, how much money should be used for health, for social safety net, right? So how much money, how much should we allocate for, again, for this medical equipment? So things are very fluid at that time. Things were very dynamic at that time. So we have to have this kind of flexibility. So that's why after, thinking carefully about this, I think is much better for us to pursue is something in between. Okay, so we issue this regular bond, but with some notes, which is that, look, the proceeds will be used to support this pandemic COVID-19 handling, something like that. Okay, and as I said that we rely so much on our reputation. As I said that Indonesia has been a frequent issuer. We've been the market. We maintain communication, good communication with our investors even before pandemic. So that's kind of really our assets. Okay, that's why I think we are quite confident even without having to label it explicitly about this COVID-19 bond or pandemic bond, right? Then I think we are quite confident the market response will be quite positive with our global bond issuance in April at that time.
Do you think there's still room for COVID-19 bonds. Now we have a pandemic. I mean, I've asked quite a few people in the market this question, and a lot of people feel that essentially the age of a COVID bond is done. That's very much a 2020 phenomenon. But some people are arguing that it should be used to deal with the long run economic impact, which does open up the possibility that Indonesia could sell a COVID bond in 2021. What's your view on this?
Okay, first, that before we make that kind of decision, we need to look at our reading, what's going to happen in 2021. So the way we look at this 2021, I think we're still dealing with this uncertainty and volatility in 2021. There's some good news about this vaccine development, but for Indonesia, even this vaccination will be quite challenging even for Indonesia. Why? We are a big country, the largest archipelago in the world. So we have 17,000 islands. We have 260 million population. So can you imagine that if we have to vaccinate everybody, right? All these 260 population, right? It's gonna take some time. And we also, as I said, need to consider about this geographical situation or challenges. Okay, it might take some time for Indonesia for all Indonesian people to get vaccinated. Okay, and number two, at the same time that economy also still needs some support. Uh, if there is no support from government, yes, the economy will be recovering, but maybe in terms of speed, it's gonna be quite slow. To jumpstart the economy, to make it to make this recovery even faster, it still needs stimulus, incentive, support from the government.
Yeah.
So that's why in 2021, that priority are still two: how to deal with this pandemic COVID-19. Dealing with with pandemic means that first in terms of vaccination, as I said, but at the same time, still because vaccination needs some time, so this kind of situation will remain for or will be the same for quite some time. So it means that our support to health sector, our support to this social safety net, still quite huge for 2021. At the same time, government is needed, right, to jumpstart the economy. What kind of support can be provided by government to support this economic recovery program? So all in all, that's what we have to deal with. Still the same, that I think it needs some kind of flexibility.
Yeah.
It needs kind of uh, quick response as well. But now the challenge is even bigger, that I think we also have to pay bigger attention also for this economic recovery program. So go back to your question about this, do we plan, or do we have plans to issue this COVID-19 bond issuance, let's say next year? The answer perhaps, I'm not, we are quite flexible, so I'm not closing the door, right? But at the same time, just for you to understand our situation, that government Indonesia needs some kind of flexibility. So there are always some pros and cons, positive and negative, about going, for example, going green, going with this pandemic COVID-19 bond, right?
Yeah.
So that's what we need to really, as I said, carefully think about this.
Yeah, I mean, the best approach might be to do what you did in April, which is a sort of COVID light structure. That gives you the flexibility of use of proceeds while also making clear to investors that the
Exactly.
ultimate aim is to fight the pandemic. Yeah, you touched it a few times on the fact that, of course, all this hinges on a lot of uncertainties for next year, particularly in terms of the economic outlook. What should investors expect when looking at Indonesia's economy next year? What is the outlook from your point of view?
Okay, if you look at what happened in 2020, So Q1, the first quarter, our growth has been affected by this COVID. Normally, our growth is around 5%, the growth, right? And the first quarter is only 3.3%, I would say. And the exact number is 2.97. And then in second quarter, that we went down. So now the growth for the second quarter already 5%, 5.3%. But that happens everywhere. If you look at ASEAN 5 countries, our neighbor, all of them grew negative double digit. Right? Malaysia even minus 17%, Philippines minus 16%.
Yeah.
Right? I think looking at that comparison, Indonesia is a bit, relatively better compared to our peer countries. And the third quarter, so things have been improving. Okay, that our growth in the third quarter is only minus 3.5%. So we feel that the way we see it, that the worst is over. That was in second quarter. Now we have this kind of momentum in this positive growing trajectory. So fourth quarter, we hope that it can be around 0%. And in total, perhaps for the whole year, 2020, yes, maybe still contraction, but not that much. That's kind of the situation for the whole 2020. And 2021, that first, okay, why don't we look at kind of this, institution like IMF, World Bank projection, right? So I think they have quite convergent projection on Indonesia. The growth for, I think there will be rebound in 2021, and the range, if you look at this IMF projection, World Bank, ADB, I think it's around 4% to 6%. So yes, don't spend too much time, arguing about what's the right number. But at least if you look at the trend, it's around 4-6% is huge, significant jump from what happened in 2020, which is, let's say, around between 0 to or minus 1%, right? That's what's important. Okay, I think people are quite optimistic looking at Indonesia economy, Indonesia fundamentals. Okay, if you ask government, official number from government, we are looking at 5% growth for 2021. Of course, the question, how do we achieve this? Okay, is it realistic? And first, of course, we have this advantage by having what's so-called low base effect. That again, that's also true for all other countries, other economies. But number two, Indonesia also has undertaken quite bold reform. We just passed the new law called Omnibus Law on Job Creation. So basically, this is, even during difficult time, Indonesia is very committed to undertake this bold structural reform by issuing this Omnibus Law on Job Creation. So yes, the title is Job Creation. Basically, this is how to attract more investment, how to cut the red tape, how to simplify regulation, how to transform the economy. So those, if you read this, our Omnibus Law on this job creation, that's what it's all about. And we have 3 months. This was issued in October. Now we are in the process, because in our legal system, that this law still, we need to issue what's so-called implementing regulation to make it operational. So we have 3 months, and we hope that starting 2021, this Omnibus Law on Job Creation can be implemented effectively in beginning of 2021. That's kind of one of the key driver how we move our economy, how we boost our economy in 2021.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'd like to ask you about something you touched on right at the start of this call when you were talking about the government's response to the pandemic. One of the major changes we saw was the burden sharing agreement with Bank Indonesia, where the central bank buys government bonds, but they essentially forego any interest payments. Now that's a form of debt monetization, which as you're well aware, can sometimes set alarm bells ringing with economists and foreign investors. So anyone who's worried about a potential slippery slope of debt monetization in Indonesia, what would you say to them?
Okay, first of all, this pandemic COVID-19 situation, as I said, this is something extraordinary that also require extraordinary solution, extraordinary policies. And again, it happens everywhere. If you look at both advanced countries as well as developing countries, they have to undertake quite unorthodox policies, I would say, breakthrough policy. So those two things, right? First, in terms of size, we're talking about huge, big, substantial size of this stimulus, and then both for monetary and fiscal stimulus. That's number one. And number two, in terms of schemes, in terms of structures, in terms of instruments, right? So if you look around, that those countries, government have to, authorities have to undertake quite unusual breakthrough policies, I would say. And it should be noted as well that every country has its own challenge, domestic situation, politics situation, and so forth, right? So the fact, for example, the US, uh, Indonesia, compared to the US, that our financial market is still quite shallow. Municipal bond doesn't exist in Indonesia. Corporate bonds is very small share in Indonesia.
Yeah.
Right? So we have to come up with this. Okay, if you want to save the economy, if you want to help the economy, what should we do? But looking at what we have, the situation, condition of Indonesia economy that might be different from other countries, from other economies. Again, long story short, again, if you look at the journey, as I said that in April, we decided to widen our budget deficit to only 5.1% at the time. And then under our emergency law, BI is allowed to purchase our government bond in primary market, which is before, again, they were not allowed to do so. However, when we discuss with BI, we agreed. Okay, first, yes, we need to still respect. We need to kind of respect the market integrity, market credibility, as well as institution integrity, institution credibility. Okay, so that's why we came up with this what's called the first joint decree, we call it, or the first MOU, in which under this scheme that BI will be functioning as what's called standby buyer. So we issue the bond, right? We have some financing needs, and then BI will be at the end as what's called standby buyer. And it went through what's called market mechanism.
Yeah.
That's how we design our kind of collaboration support from Bank Indonesia under first MOU. However, as I said, things are developing quite quickly, very rapid. And in June, we decided to even, it turns out the situation bit, it needs even stronger government intervention, government need to step in even more. So it was translated into our new budget deficit is even bigger, even higher, to 6.34% of GDP. And looking at the market situation, right? So I think we need even bigger support from Bank Indonesia. So that's what we do. We're talking with Bank Indonesia, and then we design the kind of what's called second joint decree or second MOU. So we came up with this scheme of a so-called burden sharing. But still, the principle to respect, to maintain this credibility, integrity is still there, is still our point of concern. So that's why the way we do it, for example, that from the beginning is already clear, it's already transparent. We set the numbers. Okay, we have identified about the needs, our needs to support the economy that, of course, we call it public goods. Public goods, basically, this is kind of really basic needs, the thing that economy really need, right? So we're talking about health sector, we're talking about this social safety net, and also support to our ministries and also local government. So we put the numbers. This is what we call public goods. And then the financing, we issue the bond. The bond will be purchased by Bank Indonesia. We pay the coupon. So, but the coupon will be returned by Bank Indonesia. So it's not zero coupon. That's what I'm trying to say. But everything is very transparent. It's very clear. Okay. So in this case, market analysts, investors know about this the scheme. Okay, there's nothing to hide. Okay, so we always maintain the communication with our investor, with also with the market. So that's what we are doing. Hey, again, Indonesia is not alone on this. If you look at UK government, they do the same thing. Kind of their central bank also can buy government bond directly, right? And then we, not to mention, not to forget, we also communicate with rating agencies. Okay, I think so far the response, fortunately, right, has been very supportive, has been very good, has been very positive. I think they could see the needs, they could understand about what's going on, why we do this. Yes, we also look at the possibility impact on inflation, but because we know this crisis takes place in both sides, demand and supply side, and uh, as long as vaccine has not been discovered yet, I think the way we live with this social distancing, with this lockdown, I think it's something that we have to deal with. So that's why we anticipate that yes, perhaps aggregate demand will be lower.
Yeah,
So
sure.
that's why we also look at the impact on inflation. Perhaps this year will be very minimum. And so far, it is true that our inflation so far is only 1.5%. The outlook for the whole year is going to be also around 5.1%. Sorry, 1.5% for the whole year, much lower than the normal inflation that we have in Indonesia is around 3%.
Yeah.
And the impact on currency also has been very minimum as well.
Yeah.
I think, and then last but not least, our the last rating assessment by Fitch also showed that I think this kind of scheme has been well received. And however, the last point I would like to make that so far that uh, government in Indonesia have agreed that this is the second MOU or the burden sharing scheme is only one off, only for this 2020.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Let's talk about your funding target for next year then. Could you outline for us how much you expect to raise, but also the likely choice of currencies?
Okay, next year, first, of course, but financing need it will be determined by kind of our budget situation. So the budget right now, the budget deficit for next year is set at the level of 5.7% of GDP. So this is part of government plan to have what's so-called fiscal consolidation. But dealing with this pandemic COVID, that government budgets still need quite expansionary to provide some kind of counter-cyclical support to the economy. So again, in terms of number, we are going from 6.34% of GDP deficit in this year, 2020, and next year will be lower, but perhaps not that much, 5.7% of GDP.
Right.
Remember that our target, we are allowed to have this fiscal rule 3% of GDP being relaxed, right, only for 3 years. 2023, right, that we have to go back to deficit below 3% of GDP. That's kind of our commitment. But the way how the transition, how we move from 2020 to 2023, it has to be smooth. And this year, our budget deficit is set at the level of 5.7% of GDP. So in terms of number, perhaps in terms of nominal number, it's pretty much the same. But the needs in terms of gross financing needs, for example, for this year, for next year compared to this year. But the question, how do we fulfill, how do we get this financing? First, we're going to use government internal resources. We have a so-called accumulated cash surplus from previous years. We're going to use that. And we will continue working with our development partners, both multilaterals and bilaterals. This year, 2020, we have almost around 6.9 billion US dollar support from multilateral bilateral agencies like World Bank, Asian Development Bank, AIIB, Islamic Development Bank, from KfW Germany, from JICA Japan, AFD France. Okay. Next year, this is still work in progress, but however, we expect that we will also could get the big, strong support also from our development partners. The third step is, of course, we're talking about this issuance, this bond issuance.
Yeah.
Yes, was issuance part of our diversification, risk management. We will issue rupiah and non-rupiah. For non-rupiah, we will issue, for now, pretty much the same. We're going to issue US dollar global bond conventional, US dollar global sukuk. Part of it will be in green sukuk. Number 3 is samurai bond in Japanese yen, and number 4 is samurai euro bond in euro. We were thinking, for example, that now we are exploring. We are still work in progress that to issue this SDG bond for conventional. So sukuk for green, now for conventional. Now we are exploring what's called SDG bond. And going to domestic market, we will issue both conventional and sukuk, and as well as, not to forget, we are also working on what's called this retail bond. Okay, and again, last but not least, support from Bank Indonesia under the first MOU, in which Indonesia will be the stand buyer for our bond issuance every week. That's perhaps kind of the financing strategy plan for 2021.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was fantastic. And let me just ask you one last question before we finish. I'm interested to see what you're most worried about for the coming year. COVID right now, it still represents great uncertainty for us economically. But we at least are at a point where vaccines are becoming available in a lot of countries. As you said, actually implementing that vaccine and giving it to the entire population of Indonesia is going to be logistically difficult and expensive. But that's now in sight. There are other uncertainties on the horizon, however. The most obvious would be what's going to happen between the US and China. We've had this trade war raging for the last 4 years. There's no real sense from people I talk to that the trade war is going to be entirely off under a Biden administration. But it could change. The dynamics of it could change, and it could be less impactful for Indonesia. But of course, there are other uncertainties on the horizon. There are known unknowns, but there are also unknown unknowns, which are potentially the most tricky. So what are you worried about for next year? If you could kind of outline what keeps you up at night, that perhaps investors should also be taking a closer look at.
Okay, first, you are very right that when we design our policies, when we design our budget, when we design our development plans for 2021, yes, the center still in this, COVID-19 pandemic. So we're talking about the prospect of this vaccine, how effective the vaccine will be, right? As I said, for Indonesia, even the vaccination program will be it will be very challenging. Looking at the number of population, not looking at this geographic situation, right? So that yes, pandemic COVID-19 still kind of risk number one, I would say,
Yeah.
that can create some kind of uncertainty for us. So that's why the way we design our policy, including our budget, including these financing needs, right? So still going around how we deal, how good we are dealing with this, managing this pandemic COVID-19. And other than that, so yes, global risk and domestic risk. Global risk, now that we have new president, the new US president, yes, we still have to wait until January, but things are much clearer now. You're right that the tension between US and China will not disappear. However, in terms of form, maybe it's gonna be a bit different. Yes, there is still question that how different it will be, but I think we are expecting that the approach will be different, I would say, okay, under this Biden presidency. And but for sure, the threat tension will still be there. That's how we read it. And again, the uncertainty on Brexit are also still lingering. That how the outcome uh, of this the deal between EU and UK also something that we need to pay attention.
Yeah.
And of course, geopolitical situation uh, pretty much the same. I mean, still there. The risk in Middle East, for example, and in North Korea, in Iran, I think still something also we should be watching. And however, there are some good news. For example, for us in Southeast Asia, with this RCEP, right, the trade agreement,
Yeah.
I think it's also something very positive that hopefully could also trigger the stimulus, the improvement in our trade post-pandemic COVID-19. And of course, last but not least, but these commodity prices. Uh, yes, when the economy improving, hopefully the commodity prices also will be improving. But on the same time, at the same time, because we're talking about commodities, uh, weather, climate also becomes very kind of one factor that we also need to be watching. Post La Nina, what's going on? So, for example, now CPO has been improving, which is good for the Indonesia economy, and to some extent it's because of this weather or weather climate situation, right? That's kind of also something that we are looking at.